global pandemic, which has exacerbated existing weaknesses. And of course, we await to see what the impact of Brexit will be, particularly in border areas. So I think the cumulative impact of all of this is a lack of enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights by many. So the question then has to be, how do we deal with this? How do we make rights real for everyone in Northern Ireland? How do we make them more than an exercise on paper? And as set out in your New Decade, New Approach strategy, we need to think about how best to establish cross-community support, because it is critical to advancing the Bill of Rights. And here I wanted to talk about, as I was asked to talk about, my own research, which has been looking at, in particular, Protestant Unionist Loyalist communities in rural border areas, although I did actually look at mixed groups as well, which illuminated a number of issues about engaging these communities with human rights and economic, social and cultural rights. And really, this is stressing the particular need to engage all sections of Northern Ireland society, including those communities who've traditionally been quite wary of human rights and human rights rhetoric. So I won't, for time reasons, go into full detail. Again, I'm quite happy to take questions and give further detail around this. But to summarise the main findings, everybody that participated in the study was either struggling to realise all of their economic, social and cultural rights in some way, or they were working on the front line helping those who were struggling. And I think what was quite surprising for myself was the high incidence of rural poverty, and also the impact that austerity had had on perhaps those in the community that wouldn't previously have seen economic and social rights as relevant to their lives in particular. What was also interesting, though, there was very firm support for the idea of human rights and support for a Bill of Rights, although that was more contentious. But there were a number of obstacles identified in harnessing that support for human rights. And those were issues such as the previous framing of human rights and political discourse around human rights, limited knowledge and understanding of human rights, in particular economic and social rights, and misconceptions around these rights, but also limitations due to the locality and the geography of the rural borderlands. So it came up several times about limited public transport, about a lack of centralised or a lack of localised rather initiatives, so that there was limited engagement with any human rights events that were going on because they all happened up in Belfast. So this lack of local initiatives meant there was a lack of local kind of engagement and training and dialogue. Added to that, mistrust was a huge problem. There was a lot of mistrust of human rights institutions, of state institutions and NGOs, a perception of bias sometimes, and that even extended to academics. So the other two obstacles I want to mention are cultural and communal norms, and the absence of any leadership or advocacy around human rights within these communities, and also on how they could be used to help build peace. So to conclude then, there were a number of actions that can be considered, I think, to advance the Bill of Rights within these communities and generally. I think in the PUL community, dialogue can be enabled through a number of entry points. I think, first of all, stressing the universality of rights and using an international human rights standard as a starting point for discussion is very beneficial. I also think that focusing discussion on rights that are prioritised by the community themselves, that they can relate to through their own personal experiences, is crucial. So I think human rights need to be relevant for local communities and local priorities. Using alternative language that resonates with the PUL community is also important as a starting point for conversations. So talking about and around fundamental needs, access to services, and values of compassion, humanity, and dignity. Local capacity training and education on human rights needs to take place in localities as well as in urban centres. And obviously, this will require further investment perhaps and engagement with all sorts of stakeholders to try and open up those conversations. And then I think significantly, as I mentioned, leadership from within the community itself is crucial. So developing some kind of local legitimate voice for human rights mobilisation and advocacy is key to bringing everybody on board. I also want to mention if we go back to the Northern Irish Human Rights Committee in 2008, there was a recommendation around the right to be free from violence. And although not strictly economic, social and cultural right, I think this is important in terms of tackling threats to people who speak up on human rights. So back in November 2019, I think, I was doing some work with some PUL activists in East Belfast, and the problem that was raised there time and again was problem of fear of speaking up on rights, of having that conversation. So I think that needs to be addressed as well. More broadly, I think it's absolutely crucial to take steps to promote meaningful citizen participation from all sectors of Northern Ireland society across all communities, and ensuring most marginalised voices are included. And I think it's also important to think about grassroots work. So we've seen the polls that indicate strong cross-community support for a Bill of Rights, but I think more needs to be done to explore constituent communities, especially in rural areas. So it's about gathering views, but it's also about raising awareness and facilitating and providing information. Resource decisions as well, I think, is something we need to think about. Using a human rights framework as a lens can support investment in regional infrastructure to facilitate engagement with human rights and peace building work. And I think an international framework is helpful here if we think about core obligations and how progressive realisation, of course. But I also think budgetary analysis, there's been some work done on human rights budgetary analysis. That's also a useful tool. So I think the committee has a crucial role to play in advocating for economic, social and cultural rights. I think they are essential to the success of building a sustainable, peaceful and inclusive society for everyone in Northern Ireland. And I think these rights should continue to be viewed as an integral and imperative element of peace building policy and practice within the Northern Ireland Assembly's work. So I'll finish there and thank you very much and look forward to your questions.
Very much, Dr. Cahill-Ripley. Your presentation was useful and that was useful as well. You are quite clear there about the benefits as you see them from having socioeconomic rights in a situation like ours and in terms of the context of peace building and lasting peace. But I wonder if you could give us some detail as to how you think they're best enforced.
Within Northern Ireland? Sorry?
Yeah, within the north, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I think, personally, I think they're best enforced as legally enforceable rights within a Bill of Rights. I know there are lots of other models, directive principles, but I think the problem with not having legally enforceable rights is that the community can see them as can get disillusioned. So if their rights on paper, but they can't actually exercise any right to individual remedy, then I think that can be a way to disillusion people as to, that they can actually exercise those rights in practice. I think the question then becomes one of how do you ensure that those rights are limited in the way that you want them to be limited and speak to the values of the society and the communities that are going to access them. So, so I think they should be legally enforceable.
Okay, thanks. So then following on from that, and in your research you talk obviously about the different perceptions, particularly from people along the borderlands and in a rural setting, that there was this sort of perception or misconception that it was something that was Belfast centric, that these groups were only exercising in urban centres. And we can see down through the years, obviously we've all sorts of divisions in the north, but there's a rural urban split, or maybe even an east west split, and different infrastructure investments down through the years have reinforced that, and we sort of have systemic almost discrimination or inequality there. How then do you address that through the enforcement of rights? How do you reach those people?
I would totally agree with what you said there. I think there's interesting ways that's been addressed in other contexts. So, for example, the peace agreement in Colombia included a provision around protection of an adequate standard of living in rural livelihoods, I think was the wording, something around that. So I think it can be a question of actually recognising those discrepancies within the actual text of documents, within the provisions. But I also think it's about ensuring that you have that feed into the process of the drafting of the Bill of Rights, and I think that involves really an investment in outreach and gathering views from various groups. There are a lot of grassroots groups that are working in the West, in particular, was where I have the experience, and I think gathering those views and also discussing what rights means to people, and tackling those misconceptions. But as I said, I think it's got to be a question of grassroots up as well, and then thinking about how that is reflected in the actual provisions.
Thank you. I just have one last question. So you touched on the specific outline from NDNA in terms of the particular circumstances and then the impact of Brexit. You touched on that lightly. How much or less important do you think rights are going to be post-Brexit, and the impact that Brexit is going to have on a need for a Bill of Rights here?
Okay, so $1 million question. Personally, who knows what's going to end up with Brexit, given that we're not sure what agreement's going to be in place. However, I do think we're obviously going to lose the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. We're not going to lose the European Convention, and we've talked very much in the past about the European Convention on Human Rights Plus. But I think it's really important to think that as well about the European Social Charter. I think that gets forgotten, and that will also still be applicable after Brexit. I think the work of the European Committee of Social Rights is really important in that it has collective complaints mechanism as well as thematic national reporting. So I think until there's any further moves to withdraw from the Council of Europe, for example, we'll still have those in place. So I think there will be an impact, but I think we need to be reassured that there are those mechanisms. I think it's important to look at the European Committee of Social Rights in terms of economic and social rights, and then to make sure that the Bill of Rights reflects the added, if you like, values that are applicable for the context of Northern Ireland.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'll pass other members. Mike, Vice Chair, if you want to have something.
Chair, thank you, Amanda. Thank you for your presentation. You've detected some sort of a tension in the PUL community between support for rights and support for a Bill of Rights. How does that come about?
Well, it came about it's a series of interviews, one-to-one interviews, and focus groups with various community groups and various local church leaders, for example. And it was really having these discussions about why perhaps rights haven't been utilised so much within that community, and around those discussions, what came out of those was that people, I think there were maybe some ideas that people are ideologically opposed to human rights, particularly economic, social and cultural rights. And while there are a few, or my research found that was a very, very minimal resistance or opposition to rights as an idea, I think when we then went on to discuss the Bill of Rights, that was more contentious because people felt that they either had been excluded from discussions around a Bill of Rights, or they agreed with the Bill of Rights again in theory, but then felt that there haven't been enough consultation on what should be a part of those Bill of Rights. So there was a tension there, and whilst I would say my findings were that generally there was support for it, there was more tension around, more wariness around how that might happen and who would be in charge of that. And I think it's linked to this idea of mistrust of institutions.
Okay, thank you. We have to look at the particular circumstances that apply here. Is it fair to say that your assessment is that all those particular circumstances arise because we're a divided society emerging from conflict?
I think that while some of those particular circumstances can be, say, reflected in other parts of the United Kingdom, so for example, austerity measures can be seen as impacting negatively on economic, social and cultural rights in England. I think, yes, that the history, the background of what's happened in Northern Ireland does make it particular, because you're at a different starting point to begin with, because of the years of the protracted conflict, because of the reasons I mentioned of lack of investment and restrictions on people's lives in the past. I think and effects of that violence on individuals' well-being. So I do think, yes, they are a result of the conflict.
Thank you. And finally, in terms of economic, social and cultural rights, if we enshrine cultural rights in statute, how do you assess the implication for bodies such as the Parades Commission?
Okay, well, I will say that my research in particular was very much focused on economic and social and not the cultural. It excluded a deep engagement with the cultural because I felt the issue of cultural rights demanded attention in its own right, because it is contentious. It's a big area, so I have to say that my own project is focused very much on adequate standard of living and the right to health and the economic and social sides, and I haven't worked myself on the cultural rights side per se.
Okay. Amanda, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Michelle, I know you were indicating.
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much for your presentation. I'd be interested to know how you carried out your research. I understand that it was very focused in around the border areas, but what type of engagement did you have?
Did you say who carried out? Sorry.
No, just in relation to your research, how did you carry that out?
Okay, so the research was carried out, it's actually a while ago now, 2015, and it was carried out by myself. It was a small pilot study, and it engaged with a number of community groups. So that went from victim support groups through to people working based from churches and church leaders, some of the frontline workers that were working in food banks, for example, as well. So it was a small scale study, and then there were, as I say, one-to-one interviews and then some focus groups as well. And the idea behind it was to tap into what I saw a gap in academic literature and in the NGO world, the civil society world, in terms of looking at this particular area and these people's views. So the idea behind it was then to seek further funding to do a wider study that would cover more areas within Northern Ireland and expand that study to get a more representative sample. So that's how the research was carried out.
Okay, and where are you in relation to taking the next step towards doing a broader piece of work?
So we'll now be seeking. I've been after I finished that work, we then went off, and I was busy doing work at an international level at the UN. So that distracted me for a while. But now I'm at a situation where I've just finished some work with Poverty Truth Commissions in the United Kingdom, and now I want to try and apply for funding. Obviously, it's a difficult funding situation at the moment, but I'd really like to carry out some wider studies. I think it's really important in light of the mandate for the committee and the Bill of Rights more widely.
Okay, thank you. One of the comments in your paper, it mentions that one of the obstacles, there are obviously a number of obstacles, but one of them is the way human rights has been used and framed in political discourse in the past, and their association with being pro-Republican or as being anti-state. Could you maybe expand a little on that, please?
Yes, sure. So I think what came through particularly, and I think there was a generational aspect to this as well, but what came through in the data and the discussions with people was that they felt very much that human rights had been utilised much more by Catholic nationalist or Republican community, that they've been much more astute in exercising human rights as a call for addressing their needs. But there was also quite an interesting reflection that actually some of that might have been sort of self-inflicted, that there'd been a reluctance to engage, say, with different human rights initiatives. And whilst sometimes there was, so for example, the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, they would say, oh, well, it's biased, it's not for me. They would also then say, well, actually, if we tried harder, if we actually engaged with these bodies, we might actually get more out of it. So it was an interesting discussion around framing. And of course, I think for some of the older generation that were involved in the study, it was very much seen as, well, the civil rights movement, the background maybe to the conflict was something that human rights had become linked very much with that, and that therefore it wasn't for them.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mike asked my first question, so I'll move on quickly. It's just around the notion that the Bill of Rights could very much contribute to peace building and reconciliation here. And I'm just wondering, I myself worked in a PEL committee for 13 years before coming into full-time politics, but it was in an inner city area, and it's really just about picking up some of the words you'd used there around structural injustices and rural poverty. I'm just conscious that we as the legislators and the executive here, we would be responsible then for the allocation of resources. So whether it is building a road out to rural areas so factories can set up there, whether it's building more houses in an inner city. To what degree, just to go back to the first sentence, to what degree then does the Bill of Rights then to address their understanding of how the resources, how devolution works and how decisions are made that they may perceive as injustices but are really based on objective need in terms of how this Assembly delivers for everyone?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think one of the important things about using a human rights framework is I come back to my point about looking first to the international framework. I think it's useful in that it provides a framework for core obligations and this minimum threshold. And I think obviously, decisions have to be made with limited resources and you have to address need. And I think the value added of that international human rights framework is that it provides for that. It gives you a framework to start from in terms of what is the basic minimum threshold that needs to be met, and that is a good base. This is a starting point for then. Well, and then what can we do on top of that based on need? So I think it's important that the international framework can be utilised to help with those kinds of resource allocation questions.
Yeah, I suppose the point of getting at is it's, especially in inner city areas where they would see a new housing development across the divide and they think, oh, well, them ones always get everything and we don't. But, it's around how this would actually facilitate that, where people do see, we're moving past conflict now and we are as an assembly using the money to make sure that everybody, or, that we prioritise the spending of it. So, it's really just about how that could contribute to the reconciliation process. But
I think it comes back to this question of as you say, in building trust between, not just between communities, but also building trust between those communities and the state. So I think one of the things is that if people have, if you can refer to that, well, this is being done in a fair way, in adherence with the rights provisions, they can start to rebuild that trust. I think, if there's transparency, and I think if there's a recognition that this is, and training and information sharing about this is the framework we're using, this is how we're going to embody it in our Bill of Rights, then I think, the argument can be made that this is being done in a fair manner.
thank you.
No problem, Paula. We'll go then to the members that are with us via video conference. And Mark?
I'm okay.
Have anything? John?
Yes, please.
Do you have a question?
Can you hear me okay, yeah?
We can, aye.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cahill-Ripley, another interesting presentation to the committee. I find it interesting in terms of when you look at what we refer to as the west of the Ban, the border communities that you were in, the promising unionist loyalist community by and large are now the minority in that region. And when we concentrate at this stage on the Assembly and central government, where political unionism still has a majority, though not necessarily in the Assembly, but that overall majority, I think, within that unionist community west of the Ban, their services being run through councils which are largely Nationalist and Republican run, a Bill of Rights would actually be a counterweight to that, a protection against abuse of power. Is there any realisation of that as we move forward, even in terms of the demographic changes across the North, that a Bill of Rights is about protecting people from the abuse of power?
I think that's a really, really important point, and I think it's changed. I mean, my research, as I say, was a couple of years ago now, but I think the realisation was that is coming about, but very slowly. I think the idea that human rights were a tool to bash the state, and we're seen as anti-state. I think that's diminishing, particularly with youth. That doesn't, they don't recognise that. But whether that translates into seeing it as a positive protection against abuse, I'm not sure they're there yet. I think it depends very much on the generation of people that you're talking to in terms of age. I think there seems to be a big disparity between younger people who think about human rights in a much more international way. They think about human rights as being a positive thing no matter where you are, and the older generation who still see it as more contentious. So yeah, I think that's something that's not fully kind of embraced yet or appreciated yet.
I also suspect, however, that within the nationalist community and indeed the broader community, that the rights agenda is an abstract idea. You only realise you don't have rights until you go looking for them, or you have been abused by power. And that power might be your local council, your local health service, whoever it may be. I'm not talking about the political power either. So how do we break this down? I took a few notes when you were speaking. This is largely in regards to the PLU community, but I think it's across the board. Language, outreach and leadership. How do we make rights relevant to people in the sense of that they are concerned that either the absence of them or that they're involved, and we will be discussing later on in the committee how we promote the work of this committee through various aspects. How do they involve themselves in the framing of a relevant Bill of Rights?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Again, it's a crucial question, and I think although austerity has been in my opinion, has been a terrible. The impacts have been deepening and worsening poverty. If there could be a silver lining to austerity, it has been that I think people that would not normally have found it difficult to realise those rights themselves in relation to food is probably the most example that stands out the most. And so the increased use of food banks, for example, I think that again, healthcare has brought people into a context where they're questioning, well, I've worked all my life, I'm still working, but I can't afford to feed my family, or I can't get healthcare. And so there's a question about, well, why is that? So I think there's an opportunity to then say, well, actually, you have a right to right to food, a right to healthcare, and for some people, it's like they don't even know that those rights exist. But other people think, but how do I exercise that right? So I think it's a combination of we need to get in there, have these conversations, and I think to do that, there's got to be. It's no good me rocking up to try and tell people how to do this. It needs to be people within, like a legitimate voice from within the community that people trust, to take on this role and promote human rights as something that's useful. But alongside that, I think there's a role for others to help with training around human rights and how they can be exercised. And I think that can be through civil society organisations. We've seen For example, there's a group in Scotland called Making Rights Real, and they are a new civil society organisation that are working to go into communities and teach them about their rights and teach them how to exercise those rights. And I think that's really needed. And I know another example, Participation and Practice of Rights in Belfast, done some amazing work. But again, those kinds of initiatives need to be taking place outside of Belfast and in these areas. And to do that, it needs engagement from, I think, particularly from faith-based groups and community groups. We need to get those people on board to help spread that word.
Okay. I think there's a concern among some that a Bill of Rights denudes or takes away the power or the responsibility from politicians, that almost we become rubber stompers rather than legislators, rather than those people who are elected to lead. And I'm very protective of the rights of politicians because we have a mandate. We go out to the people, we get a mandate, we go in and we do our job. Whether people agree with it or not, the best way to deal with that is to either elect or not elect us again. In terms of nations where a Bill of Rights have been in place, has it undermined the authority of the elected chamber?
Well, I think this comes back to the question around separation of powers, and justiciability of economic and social rights has always been seen as controversial because of this issue of, well, will the judiciary, will they get involved in making decisions that shouldn't be made by the judiciary, that should be made by the legislature? And I think it's about getting that balance. I don't think a Bill of Rights at all absolves politicians of their responsibility to carry out their mandate. I think it's important in terms of having a set of not just substantive rights but values that again are transparent, and that it's a responsibility of politicians but also everybody to realise rights. And I think also it's a question of having a Bill of Rights with justiciable rights is something that can deal with rights on an individual level. And so it kind of works in two ways, where you've got politicians responsible for setting policy, and you've got the courts that are there to deal with any individual cases that might arise, that can then feed back to politicians if policy needs to be amended or if something's not working. So I don't necessarily see it as being detrimental at all to politicians' mandates.
I'm just looking at the notes here, so excuse me when I torn away. I just want to check one of the. I think it was around 2014, 2015, the Assembly passed the Rural Needs Act, and it was pointed out to me earlier today that the interpretation of the department means the Department of Agriculture, but also rural needs, the interpretation of rural needs means the social and economic needs of persons in rural areas. So in one way, in that piece of legislation, the Assembly has already recognised the need for socio-economic rights. And I think, once you have pieces of legislation which have been in place for a while, some may argue it's not strong enough and hasn't been used enough, and some of the departments, in my opinion, only play lip service to it. But we have accepted the principle of socio-economic rights elsewhere, and it is workable, and it doesn't constrain the role of government, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a million. Amanda, before I let you go, can I just ask one more question? We are in the process at the minute of working on a public consultation that we're potentially going to put out to the public around what a Bill of Rights would mean and asking people for feedback. Given that you have done a bit of work on this, I'm just wondering if you had any input as to how we're best framing that. I think someone referred there to the fact that, you know, rights are seen as quite abstract, and, you know, unless you're fighting for a right, you're not aware that you don't hold it. Is there a way that we can make it accessible to people, or how would you frame it if you were doing a public consultation?
Is the public consultation going to be in the form of questionnaire, or is it going to be more in-depth focus groups, or what?
Public consultation, that will be an online questionnaire.
Okay.
First instance.
Okay, so I think it's about having ensuring that the questions are both closed-ended questions, but also some open-ended opportunities for people. I think it's about the language you use, and I think maybe including questions around not just the Bill of Rights, but what do you understand by human rights? What rights would you identify, and whether people have experience they think of those rights being threatened or violated. So I think maybe starting off at a level which is not straight away about the Bill of Rights would be interesting in covering people's views of human rights generally and what they actually understand by human rights before moving on to questions about a specific Bill of Rights. But I'm happy to send through some of the questions that I used in my own research to the committee, if that's helpful.
I would imagine that would be really helpful.
Okay.
Thank you, and thanks in total for everything today. That was a really good presentation, so thanks for...
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Good luck.
We'll let you go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, so the next item on our agenda is Chairperson's Business, and we don't have any today. And then we've got the draft minutes. So the minutes for our last meeting held on the 17th of September are at page 21 of the pack, if members are content. You are? Perfect. Next we've got matters arising, and we don't have any matters arising. The sixth item is correspondence. Again, we don't have any correspondence. And so item 7 is our forward work programme. I can refer members to the draft forward work programme from page 28. Are members content to note?
Content.
Perfect. Is there any other business that anyone wants to raise?
Were we not going to discuss the communications plan today?
Yeah, so we're going to do that in an informal session.
Oh, sorry, that's okay, sorry.
Yeah. So the date, time and place of our next meeting will be Thursday the 1st of October at 2 p.m, when we'll hear from Baroness Helena Kennedy, and I'll be Sachs, and that's next week. So if everyone's happy, we'll now move into an informal session.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.